Dublin. All along O'Connell Street, the stones in Royal blue. As up went Nelson and the pillar too. Up went Nelson and the pillar too. Up went Nelson and the pillar.
That was number one in the Irish charts for several weeks back in 1966 when Nelson's Pillar in O'Connell Street in Dublin was blown up by the IRA after there'd been a bit of a discussion and a debate. And I just thought it might be interesting to start our discussion because I've got Christine Townsend from the Colston group, a former teacher, and also William Brown from Bristol National Union of Teachers in the studio. Just to start our discussion is to focus, to have a little look at this whole incident in Ireland where the IRA decided that they'd had enough of Nelson looking down on Dublin. I dug up an old report which was just a year or so before Nelson's Pillar was blown up by famous the guy that used to fly around the world, Alan Wicker, did an interview over there, which may have even been partly involved in precipitating the IRA to decide to finally do something about it. But anyway, here's Alan Wicker now.
Well, let's say a lot of us are not enamoured of what he represents or the philosophy or frame of mind that erected the column in the first place.
So what do you want to see happen to him?
What I would like to do would be to put a plaque, something to this effect, that this monument was erected by an alien ascendancy. In its shadow, Pearse and Connolly fought to end that ascendancy. Let us salute their memory and strive to complete their work.
But you wouldn't do anything to Nelson himself. You'd leave him there in all his composure.
Are you trying to put a half Nelson on me now? I'm not quite too sure about that. There's the attitude of mind of the genuine 100% Dubliner who feels, particularly if he's away from Dublin, a certain nostalgia for his native city. And one of the outstanding landmarks to him is that column sticking up skywards. He has no love for Nelson, or he has no love for what Nelson represented. But he has an affection for the irreverent phrase sometimes being used, an affection for the one-eyed, one-armed old adulterer.
We have no objection to a statue to Nelson in himself. We do have an objection to his present location. Put him up in the Phoenix Park, because I think the further away from him you are, is the nearer he might come to a thing of beauty.
The one-armed, one-eyed old adulterer, they called him in Ireland. He didn't last very long after that interview. Now, the whole business of whether a statue should be allowed to left has really kind of exploded in the US. I noticed, Christine, that the University of Texas in Austin overnight actually took down quite a lot of statues of people who were sort of supporters of the Confederacy, but some of them were actually were governors of the state after the whole Civil War had long finished, or sort of 10, 15 years afterwards. So this is a bit of a contentious issue, isn't it?
Well, it has, and you're right. It's kind of taken us all a bit by surprise, maybe, in Bristol and in Britain. But, you know, certainly I have learnt a lot more about Confederate statues, about numbers, about when they were put up, about the fact that a lot of them are hollow when they were mass-produced. So the act of and the unfortunate incidents that are going on in America and the kind of the social sort of unrest around these statues, what it actually is doing is bringing out the history that those that would argue they should be kept actually is bringing out some history that maybe people didn't know. I certainly didn't know that they were put up at certain times in the last century, or that a lot of them are hollow.
It's interesting, isn't it? Well, tell us about that hollow. Why are they hollow, some of them? Why is that significant?
Because if you watch some of the footage of when these statues are toppled, they buckle. So I saw an online video about this guy that was explaining why it is that they were buckled, and they were particularly after in the 20s and the 30s, and there was this massive rush from towns and cities in the south to get these certain types of these monuments up in their kind of public places. And actually what it was there was a particular company that were mass producing these statues, because marble or solid metal it takes a long time to make, and it's very, very expensive. And so these particular types of monuments are a lot cheaper.
It's also, I mean, people are less likely to steal them, maybe, if they know they're only if they're hollow, because the metal is worth quite a lot of money. But this is really about trying to control history, isn't it? And that's what your group is interested in.
Well, and it's also about who is celebrated and seen in public spaces. It's also about that, isn't it? And it's about how history is particularly told by one side, if you like, and trying to get the whole of the history much more understood and better represented in public spaces.
Also, he was saying there about maybe moving the statue rather than having it right in the city centre, sticking it in a museum somewhere. He talked there about Phoenix Park, so it's kind of out of the way, so it's not right in your face in a public way. But what do you think about the rights and wrongs of what's been going on in the US? This is where this story kind of started, didn't it, a couple of weeks ago? Yeah.
Well, I mean, on a personal level, there's something about young people, older people, all sorts of different people, thinking about why that particular person is there in the middle of their, in the centre of their town. Who is that person? What did they do? And do we want to continuously see that particular person, or should there be somebody else there? And, history and the way in which history is remembered and researched and different points of what happened in the past, that comes out all the time.
Well, the guys over in Dublin talking to Alan Wicker, they were saying, well, and in fact, I think it was in the song actually, saying that if we're not careful, they'll put King Billy up in the middle of Dublin. Now, he was one of the big enemies, really, of the ordinary Irish people. He was one of the people that went and fought over there. And then we were discussing last week about the English Civil War on here, and the statue of Charles I, where when Cromwell won the English Civil War, he said, you've got to take this statue down, but the guy, instead of melting it down, actually hid it, buried it or something, and then once the restoration happened, the statue came back up again. So this is actually quite it's about the present. I think I just love that George Orwell quote where he talks about the what is it? I'll just read it out again because I like it so much. He who controls, of course it starts with a he. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. And it seems that's where we are at the moment. This whole business about if you are able to say these are important figures from the past now, you're starting to define the whole direction of society.
Yes, I would agree. And I think it's also important to remember who it was that defined who was important at the time. Because certainly when the Confederate statues went up, well, the civil rights movement hadn't started, had it? And so there wasn't universal suffrage in the United States. When the Colston statue went up, it was before women got the vote. So it wasn't a democratic decision. It wasn't something that was by the people for the people. These were monuments to people that were considered to be good people, elite people, people that wanted to be remembered by a particular faction of society. And that's also part of the historical understanding.
When did the Colston statue go up? Do you know?
Late 19th century.
OK, so that was before there was any kind of universal suffrage at all. So you had to have a property. You had to own a certain amount of property in order to vote. So it's even worse than just women. It's almost everybody not being able to vote. This is when we had all the rotten boroughs and this kind of thing. Interesting stuff. Anyway, so what's also I've been reading recently about Christopher Columbus and statues of him. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I did read an article around what it actually says under some of these statues about Christopher Columbus discovered these lands as if the native inhabitants didn't exist. It's like this. It didn't exist before white males got there.
Well, certainly the Native Americans weren't very good at putting up statues in town centres, were they, at the time, and making sure they were remembered. And they probably couldn't read and write and this kind of thing. So that technology around building, architecture, town planning, and also literature is really about what this is about. It's about not about what people were feeling and thinking at the time. It's about who's got control of that technology.
Yeah, of course, and who and what messages are going to go into the future, because this is part of the furniture, if you like, of the towns and the cities in which we live, and that has deep kind of subconscious impacts on the way that people think and feel about themselves and about their city and about others that they're living with. And that is what statues are about. That's what street furniture is. That's why we have these blue plaques, isn't it, on the sides of houses that say about particular people that lived in particular places. You know, there are reasons that these things go up. And it's about who put it up, why they put it up, and when it was put up.
So what's happening with your campaign, the Counter Colston campaign, which, I mean, I was involved with a little bit a couple of years ago in exposing, I suppose, the rather pernicious activities of Bishop Mike in the cathedral, with a captive audience of hundreds of school children, when he was questioning as to whether it seemed as if whether Edward Colston was even involved in making money from the slave trade. He said this was speculation. You know, quite clearly this is actually deceiving the children, and the bishop really shouldn't be doing that.
Absolutely, and I think that was the latest spark, to be honest, Tony, around a small group of people that are building on what other generations have done in Bristol before. I mean, you know, we happen to call it countering Colston, but this has been going on certainly since I was a kid, and possibly before that. And what's happened, what some of the historians have done in recent times is gone back to the primary sources, and they've looked at the actual numbers of enslaved Africans, both that were transported but also those that died before they got to the islands in the Caribbean, and those pieces of research and that knowledge has now become kind of more widely known, if you like. It's in the public domain in the way it hasn't been previously, and those numbers are now actually being quoted, because it's clearly the best piece of historical research that exists. I'm shocked that nobody's done that research, to be honest, around Edward Colston. I mean, that's been going on. The Colston Primary School is consulting as to whether they feel that they should change the name of their primary school. As a group, we had nothing to do with that. That was something that kind of came off the back of what was going on at the Colston Hall and the debate that has kind of, you know, we've had now over the last 12 months or so, again in Bristol. And hopefully, you know, this might be the time when we do get the history out, and we do have the permanent displays, particularly in the Colston Hall, because they need to document the history that they and others have made over the last couple of decades around why the name of that building has changed.
I went and had a look in the M Shed at the exhibition supposedly about the slave trade. Well, there's quite a lot about the slave trade in there. It's one little corner. There's no mention of the merchant venturers, which almost seems deliberate to me, because it's such an obvious thing to talk about, these being the people who profited from the slave trade in Bristol, who still exist, who are still quite powerful today, and yet they're not there, which I found pretty eye-opening, I must admit. But then also we've got John Cabot, who... He was, in a way, a kind of reconnaissance mission for the colonisation, not the discovery. Can we just say this is a colonisation going on here? You're not discovering something, you're colonising it, you're taking it over, you're privatising it effectively. You're saying it's ours and we're going to do what we will. And that actually led to the wholesale, I mean, it's a holocaust, really, of Native Americans. Some quote in North and South America combined up to 100 million people dying because of the colonisation. So this is really quite a nasty, quite a running sore in a way. And to have Colston still being kind of celebrated, and also Cabot too, with Cabot Circus, with the Cabot Tower, all this stuff. You know, people might say, well, Cabot really had nothing to do with it. Well, actually, as we've been told here by the chap from the Colston project up at Bristol University, it was the same families involved in financing Cabot and then creating the merchant venturers.
And, you know, the merchant venturers are still around, and some of those families are going to be able to trace their families back quite a long way, I've no doubt. But the idea that Cabot discovered anything is just nonsense, isn't it? It's the way in which it's been documented and portrayed, and therefore taught. And that becomes part of people's subconscious understanding of their own identity and the identity of their own country or their own city. And that it's the emotional attachments that go along with that that I think need to be broken down. And So people need to be able to understand, yes, from the actual, let's expose the entirety of the history and let's see it from a different perspective. But those emotional attachments will take time for, particularly for Bristolians, to be able to let go and replace it with something else. I mean, the idea that the Matthew ship, we've got this replica ship, haven't we, down in the docks, this wooden ship. It would be very interesting to see what's on that ship in terms of what Cabot did and what it actually says, and how much of the entirety of the history is actually recorded in that ship. I mean, I've never been on it. Maybe it's something I need to go and do as a local Bristolian. I need to see what it says. It seems
to be off quite often. It seems to be away at sea. I don't know what they're up to with it. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately though, the merchants are still with us today. As an organisation, and they will say that they're very charitable. Of course, the former Mayor George Ferguson was a former merchant. The guy that's the chair of the United Hospital Bristol NHS Trust, John Savage, is a former merchant. He's now left, apparently. He's not on the list officially anymore, and he's spending £500 million every year of our money. At least he's in charge of that, and he's very reluctant to ever come and talk about it on the radio. I've never managed to actually, I put many requests in, never ever managed to get him to come and talk, even though it's supposed to be running a public service. These people do seem, it does have a sort of cult-like feel to it, where, I mean, do you think that's fair to talk about the cult of Colston? Because what people like Colston have achieved is a massive wealth fund, which really means that the people who are part of it, they and their children will never have to work again. They've got fantastic amounts of money, almost infinite amount. Well, it's not infinite, but hidden amounts of money in tax havens, almost certainly, which they don't have to declare because it's because it's a royal charter, and this kind of material is not. You don't have to talk about it at Companies House. You don't have to deliver tax returns, all this sort of thing, to Companies House, an annual report. So it is a kind of cult. It's extremely secretive, and the idea is that they're passing this wealth down through generations.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't come up with this term "cult of Colston." This was something that was first written about, that we have found as documented evidence, historical evidence, in the 1920s. By the Reverend R.J. Wilkins. And this guy basically it appears that he was the one that had looked at Colston, but also other figures, historical figures, and was basically saying, why is Bristol so obsessed with this man? Why is it this man and not these other range of Bristolians that Bristol is interested in? And he was the one that came up with this idea of the cult of Colston. But this guy was he was the lead of one of the Colston societies, the Colston charities. So he was also on the inside. Not only was he part of the church, which of course we know, the merchant venturers are also very, very pally with. But he was also on the inside in the sense that he was in and was running one of these charities. So this guy knew what he was, he had access to things that meant that he came up with this term himself. We haven't invented this. This is something that has existed for the best part of, a century now.
Now, I'm also joined by William Brown, who's the Secretary of the local branch of the National Union of Teachers. Before we talk about the cuts, William, I wonder if you could say what you make of this, because it does seem as if there are control freaks still out there. They're trying desperately to make sure that their version of history sticks.
Good evening, yeah. It is interesting. There's a few perspectives to look at it from, certainly. I think the one of control and legacy is really important. I read in Ukraine, they've just finished a big national process of removing, I think, all statues of Lenin from public places. And that's seen as a real sort of poke in the eye to Russia for what's been happening in very modern geographical politics around that part of the world. Here in Bristol, I've sort of had some experience with public engagement around the legacy of Colston and his statue in recent months. We did a creative writing week at my school back in autumn, and myself and the other Key Stage 2 teachers decided we were going to teach about the slave trade.
So what age children are they?
So this was all Key Stage 2, so that's age 7 to 11. And we sort of teamed up, us teachers went away, did a bit of research, we put together a walking trail to take our children out on a sort of day, going and looking at the historically significant sites around the city. And for almost every single child, it was a total revelation. They simply had no idea that some of the famous parts of the city, some of the prestigious buildings, and some of the names which survive come from such a sort of inglorious background, shall we say.
But at the end of the day, surely the best thing to do is to be building statues rather than taking them down. Maybe building statues of people who history has buried, or the winners have buried.
I agree. I think one of the dangers is how those statues are presented. I mean, it may be slightly controversial to say I'm not directly against having a statue of Colston. What I am against is the text that goes with it. So on the actual plaque it says, "Erected by citizens of Bristol as a memorial of one of the most virtuous and wise sons of their city." Now, I do have issue with that.
Now, you were mentioning also to me, just as you arrived, Christine, about some stuff to do with Jimmy Savile, because there were kind of memorials to him that have also now been taken down.
Well, yes, it's this kind of... what I find interesting around this debate, and we saw this with there was an article in The Guardian earlier this week about Nelson attacking Nelson's Column in London, which is why, obviously, you're playing the song from Ireland. It was only a few years ago. I mean, and people can remember what's gone on with Savile. It's etched in our memories. I've got a list here. I mean, this is just a Google search. So there was a 4-foot memorial of his graveyard in Scarborough that was removed in the middle of the night. There was a plaque on the side of the house where he lived that was also removed. There was a statue outside a children's swimming pool in Glasgow that was taken down. In Stoke Mandeville Hospital, there was a cafe named Jimmy's. That was changed. There was a gilded plaque that was the entrance to his own VIP suite. There were they'd made tiles, like a tile memorial, with pictures that included him. Those were all taken down. And there was something called the Jimmy Savile Hospital Trust that was set up in 1981 that is no longer in operation. I don't remember a massive discussion either in the newspapers or on the radio about people objecting to any of that being taken down. Nobody said you're erasing the history of what this man did. Nobody said, but he gave loads of money to charity and we need to remember this guy. So it's the concept of removing things isn't the issue. It's about the individual itself, and this goes back to this thing around when statues or when street architecture or when how things are portrayed in museums goes into people's subconscious, and it builds part of their identity, and there's an emotional attachment to it. I mean, that was a real shock for probably other than those people that seemingly already knew or were survivors of his abuse. It was a massive shock. Institutions across the country, huge institutions, were scrabbling to get to see how they were going to deal with it. So it's the concept of that is kind of separate to Colston the man, Colston the legacy, or Colston the image that the Victorians have kind of created for us and left for us. And that's what we need to look at. That's what we need to analyse.
I mean, maybe you're just talking about a change in the plaque underneath Colston, saying something like he was a terrible man that led to the kidnapping and murder of millions of however many million people or something like that.
Well, that's an option, isn't it? I mean, the idea.
Do we want to celebrate people like that?
That's something that the people in this city need to be having a conversation about, and we are having a conversation. I've never known. I'm in my mid-40s. I've never known Colston to be so discussed as it is right now. And I think that can only be a good thing. And what I would like to do is see Marvin Rees go to our youth parliament and get them to lead our young people in having this debate and see what they want. I mean, how do they think that this man needs to be remembered, or if Marvin can't do it, who can? Well, exactly. I mean, he's someone the man, from his ethnic background, for goodness sake. I mean, so. What about the governance of schools? Because the merchants have got a big role to play in that, haven't they, at the moment? Absolutely. And what we've seen literally this week is certain individual members of the merchant venturers, along with the church, the cathedral, actually expanding their empires. Because they've taken over the Cathedral Trust has announced they've taken over 2 new primary schools, Victoria Park and Headley Park, which is in the south. So there's still this empire-building mentality, I'm going to suggest.
Well, I think you're right. It sounds to me as if the public sector is being deliberately, the funding for it's being deliberately pulled by central government, and these guys with their massive pot of gold are just going, oh, we'll have that one on the cheap.
Absolutely, yeah. We didn't see them wanting to take Mill Pond when that got inadequate. Because the merchant venturers ran the City Academy for just over 10 years. But it got an inadequate Ofsted inspection. It was done for institutional racism, and they let it go. I'm suspicious, shall we say, about the actual benefits that certain individuals and certain institutions involved in our education system in this city actually bring, and where their motivation and what their motivation is. It should be the schools that are getting Ofsted 4s that they're looking to take over, not the ones that are outstanding. And the two that they've just taken on are outstanding.
William, for the Secretary of the Bristol branch of the National Union of Teachers, William Brown, leaving the merchants aside for a minute, what are the academies really all about, and what's the difference in the ways secondary schools mainly used to be run?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I do need to preface it by saying there are some very good academies and some very good people work in some of those academies. However, I believe, and the NUT believes, there are huge reasons to be concerned. This is, to some extent, a land grab. And the ones you were talking about being selective in which schools they take on, this is a new phenomenon. So we, collectively, not you and I, have introduced market forces to a public service. So what do we get there? We have winners and losers. So there's a modern phenomenon now called orphan schools. These are the ones which no sponsor wants to touch. They might have crumbling buildings, they might have a negative Ofsted result, they might have all sorts of problems or issues particular to that place and its community, which means it's not viable, it's not attractive for what is essentially a business to take it on. And should we allow public services to be in a state like that?
And rural schools are particularly vulnerable to this, aren't they? Because those schools that are maybe, they serve very small communities, and these are generally primary schools that do this, and they might be in very rural. We're not necessarily we're not a rural city. We're a city, so we haven't got rural. But this is a problem, isn't it? And what we're seeing are smaller schools that have been there, decades, sometimes hundreds of years, serving local communities, actually are being forced to close because multi-academy trusts don't want to take them on because there aren't economies of scale.
And then sometimes even when they have been taken on, a multi-academy trust, a MAT, they can make a decision with zero accountability about the future of the school. There's a particular one I was reading about, St Martin in Menage, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in Cornwall. Small primary in a little village. Now, there's a multi-academy trust based elsewhere in the country, many, many miles away. They are one of the decision makers. The one who signs off on the plan whether to close it or not is a member at the Department for Education. So you've got two bodies who are making a decision on the future of a community, not just an educational institution or whether it's financially viable. They are affecting a whole community who have put forward protests, they've put forward petitions, and they're basically being brushed aside.
Yeah, sounds like a top-down decision being made from hundreds of miles away. People have got no kind of democratic input into whatsoever. But what is it like as a teacher? Is there any difference working in one type of school or another?
Yes. From my sort of current perspective with the work that I do for the union, one of the biggest things which I find myself saying over and over again is a member contacts me, upset, worried, outraged at a particular treatment they've experienced, perhaps. And my first question almost always has to be, what does your contract say? And that is one of the consequences that we are just beginning to see the sort of full scale of. When there used to be nationally negotiated decisions and terms and conditions, you could be pretty certain about what you were getting into if you signed a contract as a teacher. These days, I think you probably need to have some legal background or some employment law experience to fully understand what you're signing up for in certain academies. And I've had horror stories where a member has signed one of these contracts, they didn't read it through, they assumed, I've been a teacher for decades, I'm still teaching in a school in the local area, it'll be fine. And then I look in the small print and I go, no, it's not. You've actually signed away your rights to A, B and C, and you've agreed to take responsibility for D, E, F, whatever.
So what about cuts? Because I remember we were reporting a couple of months ago 1,000 cuts. Is that the case? That's within Bristol.
Yeah, no, the scale of the cuts is just as bad as it was, essentially. There was that slight sort of acknowledgement from the government that funding could be an issue, and they reallocated some money from within existing budgets to sort of help plug some of the gaps. There is no long-term commitment to any serious real terms increase in funding. We've got a huge number of schools running at deficit. The problem has not gone away. They've tried to kick it into the long grass, and the problem has not gone away. It's not been solved. There are no plans to solve it. There is still a lack of admission that we are facing a crisis, which is already real in some places.
Now, I know you're planning to do something about it in September, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. As part of a bigger Bristol-wide rally against austerity, the NUT are going to be teaming up with the NAHT, the People's Assembly of Bristol, and lots of other trade unions and organisations, with the backing of our Mayor, Marvin Rees. And we are essentially going to be putting out the message that things have not got better, the problem hasn't been solved, and we are hurtling, not just tiptoeing towards, we are hurtling right into a serious crisis which is going to have long-term damage on the health, well-being of the children in this city and England.
That's our future you're talking about.
Absolutely. Chronic underinvestment happening now, and no plans to improve things in the near future. There's no light at the end of the tunnel.
So where and when is this taking place?
So, Saturday the 9th of March, we're going to be meeting on College Green. We're going to do a march around the city, come back, and we're going to have some speakers. I don't know if the speakers have been confirmed yet, but we're going to try and get some sort of well-respected people who have a deep understanding of the austerity narrative and its pitfalls. And then on September the 12th, Marvin and the other core city leaders are going to be presenting some of their ideas to Parliament about devolving powers and given greater budget responsibilities.
But at the end of the day, the Treasury's just going to decide, no, we're not going to give you any money.
That's what's been happening to date. People power is the only way we're going to solve this. I mean, we managed to get 6,000 people together for that last demo we did for funding for education in May, and I believe we need to keep banging that drum. We need to make it louder. We need to get more parties to realise what's actually happening. So far, I've gone and spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people about these issues, and not a single person, after they've looked at the numbers, has turned around and said, oh, actually, it should be okay. Not a single person has said that, apart from the one line that you get parroted from the Department for Education. There are record levels of funding going to schools, but it's not enough.
Well, I started off by talking about he who controls the past controls the future, he who controls the present controls the past. Well, this is about our future, folks. So, thanks to our guest in the first hour, Green Councillor for Southfield, Stephen Clark. Also to, you just heard there, William Brown from Bristol's National Union of Teachers, and from Counter Colston, former teacher Christine Townsend. Also thanks to Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers. Our sister show Dialects here every Tuesday at noon. You can catch it online now at dialectradio.co.uk. There's no politics show next Friday because BCFM is moving home after 10 years in the City Academy. The rent is racking up. So sadly, as a charity, we're being forced to leave. And as I hear, there are less and less numbers at the school. So they're looking to make money elsewhere by jacking up our rent. But we'll be back, inshallah, in a fortnight with everything you paid the BBC to tell you about the 9/11 attacks. But I didn't tell you. With some of the top journalists in the world explaining what really happened. I'll hopefully be finding out who the architects were, how they carried out the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, and why. You'll find me on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. I'll leave you with music from 1974 and Joni Mitchell. Do please join us for the Politics Show in 2 weeks' time. Don't let the banksters get you down. God bless.